cultural sites in order to kind of complete this sort of picture. It was, intended to create bountiful harvests and such. So I started looking at just the idea of a totem, basically, because those were like essentially blank totems, right? Just kind of stone statuary. And my initial idea, this is undergraduate work, and my initial focus was in ceramics. This is a combination of, for any ceramics nerds, because it's a real technical thing, it's kind of ended up sort of turning me away from it a little bit, but cone sticks and the gold and other turquoise are applied afterwards, so spray enamel and other things, brushed acrylic paint. These were rather tall. This is a photo of one, just from different perspectives. My thinking at the time was that totems being a representation of history, I would create sort of an obscure totem, something with these, that's what these little kind of coils are doing in my mind. There's sort of an obliteration of true historical information, and then also this kind of romanticization, which I ended up kind of exploring a lot further in later work. So the last one was probably around, actually the last one was 55 inches at the time. My goal was to hit the top of the kiln in a real like cliche masculine sort of thing. I had to make the biggest work possible. This guy's actually really tiny, and I like this one because it reminds me of cartoons when I was growing up. I don't know if anybody's familiar with Captain Caveman.
Yes.
Yeah, this kind of, I just see this as like a real active sort of character, like a cartoony kind of thing, and it reminds me a lot of Captain Caveman, who was this little, he had hair all the way down on it, and pretty absurd, but anyway. And a not necessary aside, but we'll get a lot of that as we go on. But I was surrounded growing up with these objects which had a really sort of strong importance to me, but also a really severe disconnect. So my family were very good about grabbing, that sounds getting art and woven items from Colombia that I grew up with. But obviously I was kind of devoid of some of these are, for instance, that Serape, like in the center, is really more Central American. You have Mejía bags here. On this side, string woven wall art on the top, and molas from the Cunayala peoples, which is really southern Panama and Colombia, and if you're ever interested, you could learn about how the U.S. obtained, how Panama was even created, really. It's a story. It's all about that canal and U.S. imperialism. So at first I wanted to try to kind of replicate these things, and I was really looking at all this like reverse applique, things like the molas, and trying to do things like that in wood. So these are like little bandsaw puzzle kind of wall pieces. I was really in love with the frame. I think I still kind of am. But here I'm using color and these kind of layered, staggered layers to kind of reference woven works, and of course, and that reverse applique that I'm talking about. And those of you that we are probably very familiar with that concept there. I've kind of moved into starting to do this similar things with really toning down, trying to obtain any sort of historical accuracy. It really seemed a little bit disingenuous, and I will say, I think I'm maybe the authority on what I'm doing, but I don't want to say I'm the authority on what anybody else is doing, or that this is engaged in any sort of pure cultural reclamation or anything of that sort. In fact, I think I'm moving more and more away from that and becoming, trying to make work that is a little bit self-aware of the fact that it's not, that I am living in America separated and estranged from those aspects of culture. At first, with that work, one of my, it wasn't an influence at first, it's somebody I discovered after the fact, and unfortunately not through proper academic channels. A lot of that, I'll share a lot of artisan inspirations. It's not meant to suggest that I am on par with any of these artists or anything, just that they have personally resonated with me. And I discovered Joaquin Torres Garcia and his work and his philosophy of this universal constructivism was initially really enchanting. So he worked with a Uruguayan artist who worked with, traveled internationally, worked with Theo van Doesburg, Piet Mondrian, and a lot of the names that are in history books. His name, not so much though. There is quite a resurgence, I think, in his contributions. And one of the things that he came back with was that he could create these formal gestures that also referenced the indigenous language and cultural language of his homeland. And then here's this quote, which really I think is kind of also kind of a benchmark or a foundational point for kind of how I work. I see myself as someone who's very invested in the idea of synthesis. It says, the more the person drawing has a spirit of synthesis, the more of a constructed image he or she will give us. Joaquin Torres Garcia wrote that in 1930 in The Will to Construct. The spirit of synthesis, I believe, is what leads to the construction of the whole painting and of sculpture. So it's really just kind of talking about dynamic construction, and but also in an increasingly globalized world. A lot of the early work really wore, if you look up Joaquin Torres Garcia, I don't want to give you guys little peeks of things, because if I show all of it, you'll be like, oh my goodness, get an original idea, please. But these things were initially wearing a lot of that on its sleeve, at least formally. And it was also a little bit, it's a very utopian idea that you can kind of create, and it's a very modernist idea that you can create a kind of universal language. That's where he's coming from. This means that that this like kind of pluralism could be expressed in a way that is not going to negate or round the corners on other cultures and leave voices out. So that part of it, I think, is maybe not as popular of a notion currently, and maybe a little bit, utopian. That sums it up, idealist. So I really started gravitating towards, I've always been interested in objects. That early explanation of how those woven objects affected me is probably a little bit of a gloss over, because it's really a unique experience to know that something you're looking at is could very well been made by your mother's hands, right? But you have no understanding of what that object actually means. So all these woven objects had a really strong pull to me, but also an insane disconnect. But that attraction to objects and their histories and their meanings, I think, is a really important place for where I work. And so here we have, this is actually looks on the bottom left here, it looks kind of like a bike rack, but it was some kind of ventilation. At this time I was at University of Memphis, and they had, Memphis is an interesting city for found objects just because there's a lot of stuff. You drive down the street and you're like, oh, look at that, oh my goodness, so it's like a great place to have a Wagner truck and be a sculptor, because you find a lot of things. This was some sort of ventilation system. Also the university's like big construction dumpster just happened to be right outside of the sculpture studio, so it was like really nice. I was almost always risking tetanus in there, finding cool things. So that's where those came from. And the idea on this one is that they're kind of like landmarkers, or just markers of place, but also because of that idea of place being important, I was really trying to make something where the form itself was also kind of the path that you would take. So if you were to walk through this, you're doing that same sort of thing that these little curlicues are doing, basically. On the top left's a really architectural kind of, it's like getting into like, what a dorky little saying, but like inner child, like I used to play with, you guys may have done the same, but I'd like create little landscapes, take all my little figurines and stuff and set them up and make little things. And so it was working in the miniature in a manner of speaking, and there's actually like some little figurines and things in there. It looks like a mock city or architectural model in a way, but also harkening to kind of ideas of, at the time I was reading, what was that called? I should know this before I start talking about it. I believe it's called Mezcal. It's a graphic novel by French artist Mobius, paired with, did Holy Mountain, let's see, Holy Mountain, El Topo, Jodorowsky, and a lot of the whole idea, the premise of that graphic novel is what would happen if colonialism, never happened. You have cityscapes that look different. You have superhero lore that's different. You have, all these kind of cultural suggestions which are absent in today's Euro-dominated sort of landscape, right? The other thing is just some lights, like very industrial kind of lights with geometric form, geometric abstraction woven in them. The history of the objects is really important. I started gravitating towards weathered materials that speak of histories beyond the use or the art functions, if you will, that they employ. A lot of ventilation stuff making its way into things just because of my proximity to that sort of trash, essentially. So the idea of remnants has always been really important. And it's also kind of, in my thinking, like a counterpoint to the kind of coldness that is in some interpretations of like high modernism, and just makes it a little more accessible. Of course, there's lots of traditions like Arte Rivera, or the Chicano art movement, Rascuache or Rascasquismo, which is literally means leftover, or that without value. And so it's one of the things I'm kind of consciously employing at this time. But a lot of what I'm doing, I also make music, or I should say maybe used to, because I don't do as much anymore. But at the time, sample-based production was really important to me. Still is in terms of what I listen to, somewhat. And in a lot of, even in pop music, the idea of the finished product, the idea of the complete has really been severed by sample culture. It's in my opinion, one of the most important musical and kind of artistic kind of ideas of this century, potentially, that things are not finished, things are not complete, and that other hands can continue to tinker and touch and manipulate and own things themselves. So a lot of what you see are really me processing modernist gestures. Here I was really looking a lot at Louis Bourgeois' cells, so I wanted to kind of stretch myself into making something that people could enter. I make very frontal work, admittedly, very painterly, not in terms of painterly like aspects of brush, but painter in terms of planar and frontal sort of presentation. So this was an attempt to sort of stretch out a little bit more. Plus, at this point in academic teachings, I would get the kind of like, you're in sculpture, right? You should try making something that embraces physical space. Yeah, that's a pretty good idea. So that's kind of where this comes from. We're using window frames and just a lot of found lumber, as well as tape painting, wood stain. I like the combination of bright colors. I like the naturalistic, if you will, tendencies of the wood grain. But my work doesn't have any sort of purity. If anything, it's actually like guilty of a lot of the things it's critiquing. It's like a Zeno's paradox in a way. I'm like walking towards a goal, but because I'm employing those same strategies, which I'll kind of talk about a little bit later, it is not reaching a point where there is any ultimate resolution. I think there is sometimes a pressure on artists to solve the world's problems through some sort of visual thing. My work does not do that whatsoever, so like, I have not made the piece that will solve racism or anything like that. Speaking of those kind of negative aspects, at this time, I just moved to Bloomington. I was starting graduate school. I should also say I was a non-traditional student. I worked for about 10 years as a sound engineer at a bar, and as a kind of struggling musician and whatnot. And those experiences also inform, I mentioned music already in terms of sample-based, but those experiences also informed my practice, as did this one. I took a job. At this time, Urban Outfitters was being sued by the Navajo Nation for a line of products branded Navajo, which included underwear and flasks and all kinds of just terrible stuff. And I read an article that was, it was really fortuitous, because I'm reading this article in some kind of local magazine about this. And then at the back of the magazine, it's like, Urban Outfitters is hiring. I was like, okay, I have to pay bills too. So It wasn't like this, I'm not some like this like at this point like some kind of like making this big extreme activist gesture. I mean, I just really had to pay bills, and I thought if I do see them with these products, they had been issued a cease and desist, but were of selling those products. But there was a lot of chatter in different circles that they were continuing to sell them, and kind of trying to liquidate, get all the money they could out of that before the final verdict came in. So I actually got a job as I'm in school for visual arts, and I applied for their visual arts merchandising. I was already, as you see, making kind of art that was very flattened. Compressed space is kind of important to me, and it was like a weird fit. It fit, but it didn't fit. But it did inform my work because I really started to embrace some of this kind of romanticized gesture, like the colonizer's interpretation of what indigenous culture is. Here we have, and that's a lot of what my work is trying to do, is just commenting on the noise that I encounter in trying to find out more about my own positionality. And so a lot of these things may in some ways seem sort of harmless, but from my perspective, they are diluting the water, so to speak. So I don't mean to offend anyone if you have something like this in your dorm room or anything, although you could think a little bit, about what that means or what it's doing. So here we have, the hobby place, and they have, it has a different name, but I don't know. And they have this whole aisle of all this kind of stuff that's chevron patterned and teepees and their ideas of what they think is like a real chic way to present this culture. And actually these things do pop up into my work, not as much anymore, but I don't know if the mouse doesn't work, isn't visible, but this guy in the top right and kind of middle right on this one with the chevrons and the kind of almost antique wood grain on canvas is going to be in some of these works, as well as some other components. So there's both the sincere and heavily insincere elements really wrapped up. I wrestle with a lot of this stuff, and one of the places I've seen this described quite well is by Bell Hooks, who if you're familiar with, is just an amazing mind, and lots of incredible writing, willfully accessible, right? Like no, academic language is very toned down, even though it's talking about some pretty heavy things. And maybe this passage is still pretty academic, but this is from Eating the Other, Desire and Resistance, which is found in the book Black Looks. Commodification of difference promotes paradigms of consumption wherein whatever difference the other inhabits is eradicated by exchange, by consumer cannibalism that only displaces the other, that not only displaces the other, but denies the significance of the other's history through a process of decontextualization. So it's really kind of what I was wrestling with at this point. It's like, and even from an early age, with those objects I'm staring at that are, I'm told are deeply important, but are quite mysterious to me. So this idea of objects being decontextualized and then in my interpretations later kind of recontextualized has always been really important. She talks about how otherness is used as spice, in a lot of kind of visual cultures. And so I'm actually employing some of these same strategies in which people are marginalized. There's nothing heroic about this work. This is not heroic, clean, austere modernism. This is anxious, humble trash art. That is also concerned with the same formal modernist gestures. Another big influence is artist James Luna. Both of these minds have left us, unfortunately, still continue to influence us every single day. James Luna, I'm sure you're aware from Artifact piece here in the top left, which is one of his more famous contributions. I think it was 84 sounds better, somewhere around there, in which he presented himself as a kind of an artifact piece, a museum work, right? He's laying here with this didactic information around him, but that information is also very contemporary. Like around his knee, it'll say, points out scars, and it's like, scar from falling down the stairs at CBGB's during a Ramones concert. So it's not, talking about antiquity, but rather contemporary times. He's an artist who has always employed a sense of humor, which is something I don't think my work necessarily has, but I really appreciate the ability for humor to kind of make some things more palpable that would otherwise cause defensive reactions in people, and I think he is very masterful at that. Bottom left is from Chapel of Sacred Colors, in which he's employing found objects, a sort of almost improvisational aspect to this work as well. He has an album, a real album. This is the cover of it, all Indian all the time. And that jacket is also a piece of his own work, as is the photo. And then on the far right is a work entitled Half Mexican, Half Indian. This is Luciano from La Jolla, California, but also has Mexican heritage. And at University of Memphis, the chair of the department at the time was a photographer by the name of Richard Liu. And he did this silver gelatin print. They were both great friends. He had moved from California, so a lot of his artistic connections from the past were California artists. James Luna came and did a workshop and studio visits, and I was fortunate to do both, and then did a show, really spur of the moment. And at the time I was a gallery assistant at the University Gallery, and he did a lot of work kind of like the Chapel of Sacred Colors down here, and it was like, let's go to Home Depot and see what we find, let's go thrifted, and it's just really improvisational and silly, and he was probably one of the funniest people I've ever met. Really loved surf music, and but I should also say I really kind of probably weirded him out a little bit because I have a lot of personal anxieties, and at the time I was wrestling, and still always wrestle with whether or not I had the agency to do what I'm doing. And I just point blank asked him, I was like, is this cool? What's going on? Like, I told him my story, and he's like, oh, just chill out, you're good. So I've done that a lot of times. Anytime I meet my heroes, it never goes well. So a very inspirational artist. Let's see, this is a nice quote. It also seems to reference what people like the idea of bricolage. So for many, an authentic or real Native American is as different from the stereotypical white Western person as possible, and thus the white man's other. For this reason, Native American art is often only considered good, meaning authentically Native American, if it follows categories imposed on it by white critics and an art market that seeks to entertain a mainly white audience. There's similar ideas I found expressed by artist Coco Fusco, a really nice essay entitled Fantasies of Oppositionality, in which it really, she really presents the idea that sometimes the things that we present to the public as ways of entering the world of the other is really kind of a fantasy situation that in many cases could potentially just be kind of placating the guilt and other things that they experience, that they, would rightfully and should, in my opinion, this is all my opinion, experience. And so I think he's kind of touching on some of those same things. He's also someone who has made a statement that to be Native in any capacity in the contemporary world is to be a master of bricolage, to be a master of cobbling different things together. And so that's, I think, a part of my work as well. But really the core foundation or new direction, I guess, this kind of tongue-in-cheek awareness that I was trying to get the work to, this lack of purity that I was trying to express in the work. I see myself as a colonized individual. I grew up in this country primarily, raised by all the same cultural kind of situations that probably, not to generalize, because I do not know your individual experiences, but that most of us may have been. And so I can't rightfully present any sort of decolonial strategies without really owning that, at least in my opinion. And when I read Oswald de Andrade, he's considered one of the fathers, actually I don't know why, but I think they say grandfather of Brazilian modernism. He has this essay that I really recommend anybody that just likes short, weirdo art writing entitled The Cannibalist Manifesto. In The Cannibalist Manifesto, he writes about how Brazil will reclaim its own identity at this time. Artists, this is kind of a birth point for Tropicalia, the Tropicalia movement, which went through literature, music. You have like notable names like Caetano Veloso, Gilberto Ben, which may not sound heavily political now, but were really, really politically charged at the time, of kind of trying to find a new Brazilian and even potentially wider Latin American identities. The idea was that so much has been taken away that the only way we make our own new voice is by ingesting, cannibalizing that which is the colonial as well. So like eat it up, chew it up, spit it back out, make it your own. I think about those wasps that eat their things. It's kind of like again using remnants, but in a very conscious sort of way to create unique creations to speak about unique identities. Visually and conceptually, I borrow quite a bit from Helio Oiticica, who is a Brazilian artist who is heavily influenced by De Andrade's work. And here's a quote from him: "For me, as cultural urgency, it was of first importance to grab all Brazilian roots and image and confront it to American influence and overthrow its predominance by absorbing it." So it kind of creates this spectacle. These are also very interactive pieces in which navigation is very important. Right? The works unfold, there's pathways, but there's this kind of, it's kind of like you think of like a Hawaiian shirt, right? It's like become such a thing, but and this is not something I intended to say, so I don't know how accurate this will be, but it's become a thing that like is almost ubiquitous with Hawaii, but one wonders how closely tied that is to the colonial imagination and not the native imagination, or the functions of the true geographical cultural tradition. And so these are things that have caricature in them. I really like in a lot of the kind of Tropicalia, both sculpturally, but primarily in his work, but also in print and painting and things like that. You see these flora and fauna of tropical environments being kind of employed, formally, and what I like about that is how it breaks up this kind of linear and the very clean, austere sort of modernist gestures, and sort of almost, presents them as something in the world, which I think they, strive really hard to be outside of the world. And so I like that aspect, but there's also this sort of caricature, but a knowledge of history. I mean, you're seeing, kind of almost like a walk in, Piet Mondrian with cultural references and sort of a self-awareness that I find really engaging. Unfortunately, a lot of Oiticica's work burned in a fire, and so most of what exists now is reproductions, and quite a bit was lost. So I truly think that his name should, like a lot of these artists' names I mentioned, I think should probably stand stronger and taller in the whatever canon. But at least in his instance, some of it is because of those external factors, the fact that the work did not survive. I see my work as a type of autoethnography. I was actually just recently at the Halliford Museum, and I was looking at a really amazing Natalie Ball sculpture, who's someone I've really grown to admire. And she talks also about autoethnography. Here I'm using Dylan Miner's work, both a novel, or not novel, sorry, a nonfiction kind of exploration of Chicano and indigenous culture as told through the functions of lowriding, how lowrider bicycle culture is this kind of grabbing bits and pieces and making something your own. There's also another really good book I read a long time ago about how just lowrider, not lowrider bicycle, but lowrider culture has a lot to do with place and kind of posting up, not necessarily territorial in like the sense that things often get interpreted as in terms of like gang or criminal activity, but just in claiming space and having something that is uniquely yours. So autoethnography is in which The artist or author, it is a literary convention really, but it's applied more and more frequently to the visual arts as well, in which something is sort of lacking that purity because it's taking into account, and that's a weird word anyway in concept purity, but taking into account the artist or author's individual positionality, social landscape, and such. Creating Axeland is about riding lowrider bikes and the roles that has played within indigenous and Chicano culture. It's about riding around Turtle Island. I also really like homie K Baba. He's at, I believe he's at Harvard, Harvard, yeah, and I'm not sure. Writes a lot about cultural hybridity. And sometimes I think there's a wincing, an involuntary wincing that can sometimes happen when people talk about hybridity as if it's something less than. I would say Gloria Enzalduo would be another excellent poet and writer as well, who writes on similar things but in a less academic way. But really what it's kind of saying here is that it's those in-between spaces which where the meat is, basically. The real quote, because that was a weird way to say things. It is an in-between space that carries the burden of the meaning of culture, and by exploring this third space, we may elude the politics of polarity and emerge as the others of ourselves. That third space is kind of a reference to Edward Said, who coined that phrase. It's used now in architecture a lot. Like they'll be like, the museum is the third space, like home, work, and then. But here they're referring to it in terms of a place in which is immune from kind of those colonial overtones, and sort of almost a headspace or a virtual space, a virtual community. Lots of interesting writing there. More into the work here. A lot of what I'm talking about is sort of how I filter, and so it kind of seemed like a no-brainer to actually use literal filters. This kind of, in my mind, a little, setting. It's like a little meeting, gathering. I guess I'm kind of being goofy and personifying these little squares, but also this ideas of how, things are processed, how we keep ourselves both protected and allow some things in and some things out. But really, they were the actual filters to the spray booths that I used like almost every day. So I just kind of looked up and was like, these things are pretty beautiful in their own. I make a lot of work that is not included on whatever, like a portfolio. For whatever reasons, I don't, sometimes the reasons are legitimate, sometimes I'm just being overly critical. What is it? The work along the way to the work is kind of how I think of it. It's feeding other ideas, and here we have carpet, things that are touching, traditionally associated with the ground, but the relationship to the ground is being a little bit circumvented, and I just like the formal gestures of this one, to be honest. And it started getting me thinking about how complete my work needed to feel. Occasionally I make things that I don't like. This is a piece I made that took a fair amount of labor, but I ended up feeling like it was just too much caricature and not enough to describe or allow that caricature to be relevant. So there's a little bit of everything. I think there's some kind of clutch plate or a car part here. It was going in, it went into a show that was called the Auto Shop in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And so I thought it would be something cool to use actual car parts that I found. Of course, I didn't know cars that well, so I was telling everybody, oh yeah, it's a brake pad. And somebody was like, no, that's a clutch plate. But ideas of gold, long feather headdresses, and things of that nature. But it just felt, I actually like the back one in front because I feel like there's something a little over the top, kind of circusy about it. Maybe too much. I'm hypercritical, so I'm not sure how I would feel about that right now, right in front of me. But the idea of making work on these little wheels is something I'm exploring a lot at this time. I mentioned being an adoptee. There's something about being transplanted that I thought to me was succinctly wrapped up in having these clunky, mobile structures, so they're not, it's not something that looks like it's going to move on its own without, it's going to need assistance, and even then it's not something that's moving well. And so I think of, adoption and things of that nature is something that's, you're not moving on your own, right? It's something that requires a certain type of assistance or interventions. And so that's kind of one of the reasons I was trying to make this sort of these awkward vehicles, if you will. At this point, I was looking at Ramalsi. I mean, I really just like to look at things and reinterpret, look at more things and reinterpret. I really do think of myself as a visual sampler as well. Hopefully I'm putting, a stamp on them as well. I'm not trying to obfuscate the original references. This is from Ramalsi, who's both a very famous hip-hop artist and visual artist, and he had a series of work called letter racers, which were inspired by graffiti. In his works, they are letter forms turned into vehicles. They're super cool. It's kind of like, it was 80s work, so it definitely has like a Transformers vibe. He's someone who really dressed up in costume a lot. If you're familiar with like Africa Bambaataa or a lot of just early hip hop, in which that kind of disco costume, kind of Parliament funkadelic sort of aspect was a part of the things. He's a person who's really doing that, just a real eccentric individual. The letter racers just resonated with me. I also did graffiti on a real small scale. I got in trouble when I was juvenile, and that kind of squashed that for me. In fact, that's probably why I ended up getting a little more into fine arts, trying to find a legitimate channel for the things I was doing, and that is a certain privilege, for sure. But this is heavily informed by that. It's kind of got like hospital gurney wheels. There's an institutional language in those wheels, I think. All the hardware is very present, which was a first for me at this time. My father does, adoptive father, they're both classical musicians and professors, and but he was very active in like Habitat for Humanity and just finishing work in carpentry on his own. And so my initial thinking is that, things have to be clean, things have to be well done, the way you tell whether or not something is quality is in how much care is given it, right? But there's also something communicated by the speed. I sometimes get jealous of various different expressive qualities that paint can have versus, a piece of wood, and maybe it's just because I lack imagination on what to do with a piece of wood. But there's fast, quick brush strokes that feel almost improvisational. There's very calculated, clean, crisp, lines where the, human hand is almost obliterated from it. And, but also there's this idea of, I think the idea of self-construction, there is a building analogy of like auto construction where, a long time ago, there was like hippie houses that were made by this one guy who had no background in building things, and so they were all like weird hobbit stuff where the stairs didn't make sense. You're like, why is this stair really big? The next one's tiny. But that is something that I started to think was kind of interesting, this idea of auto construction, self-construction that maybe isn't quite as carefully manicured, or where its value is not in how all the labor is hidden. The labor started to become more and more present. This was nice for me just in that it was an exercise in real fidgety and fiddly in real life and with the objects themselves. And so this was kind of me being like, I found this railing, I'd been hanging onto it, it's a porch railing from a house that was broken down in my neighborhood, and all I did was, I hung on to it for almost a year, I think, maybe longer. And finally all I did was paint it, and thought it reminded me of kind of like vest wear, or kind of like bone shirt sort of things, and just a lot of, it has a sadness or a history, a dilapidation. It just communicated a lot, and I think I was obsessing about what I should do to it, and I just realized that I don't always have to do a lot, right? Kind of going to that last thing where it's not always about the labor. And that may be something that some people realize a lot sooner, but it took me, and that is still something I wrestle with. There are contemporary analogies, like a monumental, which really kind of changed the way sculptural work is considered, and a lot of contemporary work, this kind of de-skilling that you're seeing in a lot of things, I think is kind of echoed there as well. More painterly aspects here, color being really important, kind of a disconnected little rhizomatic kind of little baby piece down there. I don't know, it's a weird one. I'm also not the first person to, by any stretch of the imagination, to present any of these ideas. I mentioned Joachim Torres Garcia, but also Elizitsky, who was infusing ideas of his Jewish heritage into modernist gesture, Kabbalah, and different structures, creating the language. He's also known for the prom rooms, which are, I think my work is pretty indebted to as well. Sometimes after the fact, but I don't think the time table, matters. I think that they're kind of resonating. So in the prom rooms, they are these formalist gestures rendered in both paint and actual object that are kind of a more architectural painting. I guess now they'd probably call this painting in the expanded field or something of that nature. But I really found it interesting, and I also like the kind of sparseness and then just the how it's clean, but also kind of has a human quality as well. And so this was initially like looking at the prom room work from Elizitsky, and then kind of making my own translations of, very kind of on the sleeve, and maybe a little too much, so I cut it up into pieces and kind of made it a vehicle. I moved away from giving everything little terrible wheels, but still wanted that kind of suggestion. I almost think of this almost like a locomotive or something. You have found textiles, these artificial plants, kind of more traditional, almost like the first works was doing, that are very puzzle piece kind of sort of stuff. Also looking at the artist James Marshall, who used to go by the name Dalek, who's a graffiti artist who's worth, I think, certainly worth, and fine artist worth looking at. That I think some of my color schemes and arrangements are influenced by burlap, this lamp, this lighting, things like that. It has the lighting kind of maps out its footprint, pegboard, which I've used a few times, and then there's that little terrible, hobby store romanticization there. And then this is that chevron woven piece is also a kind of, I think, I got it at the thrift store, but I think the tag said like Southwestern Fiber Arts or something, and it's, made in New York by machine or something. I have been fortunate. I apply to a lot of things. I would recommend anybody who is interested in, I think one of the best advice I ever got from a professor was, it was like this weird tongue-in-cheek. He asked, he's fairly, at the time, he's fairly successful. He had like some sculpture magazine covers and all that kind of stuff. I don't know how you measure success. That seems kind of all right. At least, things were working for him. And he's like, do you think I'm like some, amazing artist? And I was like, no, probably said that a little too quickly, but he's like, right, but I apply to a lot of things. Like, apply to 100 things and I get into 10, but nobody sees your rejections, right? Nobody's putting your, rejected from this, rejected from that on your CV. It's kind of, was eye-opening because I just sort of think of things in terms of almost like my feelings about like the music industry, or it feels like there's certain things that are like plucked and given certain types of promotion. And I kind of figured things worked similarly, but I also think there's a whole lot of kind of legwork and just, be in it to win it kind of stuff. So anyway, long story short, I started applying to a lot of stuff. I went to MassMocha in Massachusetts, one of the largest contemporary art museums, and they have all 4 floors, I believe it is, of all the solid wall drawings. And so I spent a month with these things, literally empty museum for hours and hours, just sitting there. We had a few little special privileges because some of the places weren't open, but we were allowed to go there, and I did things like brought my lunch around this, works, and just kind of hung out. So long amounts of time, just kind of living with these, and I think that was also something that has shaped me. This is actually from my time there, working again with those filters. Ideas kind of, a lot of my gestures are I remember learning about Richard Serra's verb list and being like, the connection between language and formal gesture being really important, and how that can fuel meaning. And I just thought, oh, I've been overthinking everything. So at least I feel like my way of looking at stuff might be a little codified or codified, but it's pretty literal in some ways. So I think of like this door trying to blend in. It's like it's like assimilation, the filters, the various borders and boundaries between different information. Some things are obscuring things, almost like a fence. Netting, all those kind of things, acting and speaking about barriers. More found structures, more explorations of these kind of slatted gestures. I think there's a certain nostalgia in some of these things as well, just in kind of growing up with a lot of wood grain and wood paneled walls and things you don't see as much anymore. It's probably kind of gotten into my head a little bit as well. Sorry, I'm gonna go a little quicker. Sorry, guys. Yeah. Artificial turf. Speaking about disconnection from land, it's almost like a simulacra or something that represents what it is. Supersede, call it turf. It's not a turf at all. It's so much plastic. Here it is, kind of placed on the ground. Woven items where the tearing is really left. Also, so it's not cleaned up. That idea of tearing being something that to me was referencing like geographic dislocation. And it's really painful, not so much in these works, but some of the others in which those happen, where just somebody asked me what the most pained part of my work was. I was like, it's when I have to cut up these things and that are meticulously made, and then I don't have to, but when I do that, it feels like a really grotesque gesture. But it sort of has meaning. But it was funny because I learned from that that's not how other people are seeing things, right? There's a very kind of personal interpretation to it. I think a lot of things I'm doing. Commodity, this is like a little store box there with, it looks like a pegboard. This time I'm teaching 2D design, so there are Albers and Joseph Hitton gradation studies that are cut paper up in the mix, and that starts becoming a little more present. I think there's a lot of interesting parallels, not accidental, between those gradation studies and Latin American patterns, especially if you look at Annie and Joseph Alber's history and the past decade show of Albers in Mexico. I will say I think it probably comes from I think it came from a place of sincerity, and it's not as grotesque as some like primitivist kind of gestures or other things like that. Found objects, natural objects, and disassembled paintings. Tape starts to make a presence, just as I'm pretty infatuated with line. I also think of that as kind of, they're not the exact measurement of Buren, but I think of like the Buren stripes and other kind of formalist gestures that I'm aping, if you will. Almost a bookend sort of kind of piece, sort of opening up. Also started welding, so it's one of the first things I kind of started doing, just basic MIG welding, making stands, allowing supportive structures to become a part of things, which I think was and is something I'm trying to explore a little more. And I mentioned Albers and those the gradation studies, but also the what is it? All of a sudden my brain went blank on the title of these. 2 to 3, 3 to 4, where these two are the same color, but where their surroundings is what dictates how your eye is reading it, right? Both those gray, or the one that was a little more blue in the orange field, are the same color. It's just that you guys are super familiar with all this, I'm sure. But thinking about that in terms of, and there's a great artist who's doing this in a more literal way, Tamasha Jackson, but thinking about how color relationships and color theory can be social metaphor as well, something that occupies my mind quite a bit. Here's a close-up of some of those paper studies. I'm literally like, students are turning in their assignments, and I'm like, ooh, and then cutting them up and making them. It's pretty shameless. I'm not invested in that anymore, but it's probably just because I'm not teaching 2D. And then there's scrub brush, scouring pads in different colors that are actually like frosted with white spray paint. It's a pretty subtle gesture, but I was kind of trying to think of how I could use materials to talk about whitewashing. More of the 2-to-1 or these color studies, color field studies. And then the works are, in a subtle way, I'm kind of thinking of that when I'm making things as well. Here we have like restricted land, land barrier, plastic barrier as a footing there. And then this whole kind of ground color in which the other is the wild, the piece. And wild compared to flat, flesh colored, someone's flesh, not my flesh colored wall. Montana Paints used to have something called baby skin. Not my baby. I have done things that are kind of like call and response. I'm not sure how necessarily to feel about them here. I have found came from a thrift store. They're Ojos de Dios, right? Eyes of God. It's like things people do at camp, but it also has a traditional Central Mexico tradition, indigenous tradition. And I was really responding to it. There's also this was a different piece that just kind of got cut in half, and I like that kind of rough sever. More things that were really kind of disassembled other works. My work is engaged in that same sort of cannibalism that the Oswald de Andrade was speaking about. I don't, really offer these for sale because there's a lot of things that are not of my own hand. Some of the woven aspects, and then some of the, the idea of caricature. It just doesn't seem right for me to be selling things which have a certain kind of tongue-in-cheek caricature. It means a certain thing to me, but I don't want it to fall, this is maybe overly cautious, and that's fine. I think it's okay to be overly cautious about the handling of other people's culture. And even with my, connections to it. But it just does not feel right to have things that are both deeply important, almost like a psychological artifact. Like, I don't know if this, is going to mean the same thing in other hands. So it also allows me a freedom to use things in certain ways. And I'm not, violating, Native American Craft Act or things like that. Not that that's as much of a concern, but it's more about also being considerate of the communities I'm trying to be an ally of. This is involving like some statues of like eagle's wings there, netting. This is, I think, maybe one of the first pieces where dust mop and wool yarn start to play a bigger role. So ideas of labor in terms of how the one-dimensional caricature of a lot of Latin American labor is portrayed. Latin American identities being tethered to ideas of American labor. Another aspect, there's also, a lot of these works is an evolving ideas between craft and the handling of materials, like I talked about before. There's now like laser cut plexi replacing like wood cut circles. This little steel arms that are a little more fabricated, high fabrication versus low fabrication, craft versus fine art. Tape being a bigger role. This has a little welded stand, concrete cast, and I'm just dunking things in and letting them kind of become the base. Also, all these things end up, maybe read too much into every little gesture I make, but I like how on certain aspects things really line up. In other places things become really incongruous, right? Which is, I think, how life is sometimes too. It also acts as a frame. It speaks to me like a little bit like both, coming on borders, but a lot about kind of like games, which games always have the idea of borders too. You're in, you're out. This was an accident, or at least the broken glass was an accident. I thought I was making this little kind of porthole sort of thing, and then I dropped the glass, and I was like, whoa, this is great. And so I ended up just putting resin in it so it wouldn't break further. This one does not have tape, but it's paint on the wall that's kind of behaving similarly. These guys are kind of twins, in which a lot of the objects, some are duplicates and some are, like this is ceramic test tile on this side that came out of the trash of the institution I was in, and then on the other side is a wood kind kind of facsimile of me trying to mix those same colors that the glaze test was doing. But also I just like the, almost like police lineup sort of feeling that's coming from these. Sometimes I think my freestanding works feel really awkward, but I kind of like they're a little rigid and a little controlled. I experimented with this command strip, so there's no screw in there, and it's temporary, so I'm not just going around piercing trees. But I do like the way these plexis frame, it becomes an oculus, it frames what you're seeing, and kind of highlights certain aspects and leaves other aspects untouched. And I found that really interesting. This is in the woods in Georgia, outside of Handbridge Art Center. This is the work made at Handbridge Art Center. Dust moths becoming a bigger part of that plastic construction barrier, speaking of restriction and access being there. Artificial plants themselves are kind of another gesture that is sort of like referencing land, but not of the land. It's not land, it's not real, but it is a kind of a direct reference. It's maybe kind of a harsh analogy, but I do think of that in terms of a kind of place and estrangement. This one's a little familiar. We're getting into some things that are actually in this show.
Yeah, I'm curious. What do you think too about question and answers? If we could do that over in the show.
Over there.
Yeah, because it's about an hour now, and so it might be nice to kind of wrap this part up, and then we can. And then is it okay with everybody if we do questions, like if we can kind of refocus over there, but like in those actual physical works?
Yeah,
but I would love to hear your close up, but yeah.
Okay. Well, closing up, a lot of my works lately have been infiltrated quite literally by whiteness. It's been a really weird time, as you all know, and there's just all these things that have just gotten real super, they've always been present, but now they're amplified, and just felt like Charlottesville, blah, 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 you know, back to back, and it just ended up becoming a part of the work. So there's kind of a desaturation of color. It's been happening a lot. In fact, there's a piece in there that's probably, hopefully, my return to color, because I really love color. But works have been getting pared down. There again is that little thing keeps popping up and stuff because my work eats itself. Language of painting represented again, and then this guy, we'll talk about it over there, but that's an IKEA hack. So I had never done that before, but I